By the middle of the 500s AD, the great age of Greco-Roman antiquity was fading into history. The once magnificent city of Rome had been sacked throughout the 400s and was now ruled over by a Gothic monarchy. The western territories of the Roman Empire had been lost in the past century, falling away from its grasp as military failures, infighting at court, and poor diplomacy aggravated relations with migrating Germanic tribes who turned hostile to the imperial government. The empire's eastern half continued to thrive from its capital in Constantinople, which had become the new home of Roman imperial power, law, and identity. And here, from this eastern capital that was New Rome, there rose an emperor who turned his gaze westward across lands and seas that had once belonged to old Rome's glory. And there, from Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian saw not foreign kingdoms, but lost provinces waiting to be reclaimed. But for all his own ambition, to make his dream reality, this emperor of New Rome would need a general of equal vision and extraordinary skill to lead Rome's armies westward. And in Flavius Belisarius, he found one of the empire's greatest military minds of any age. This historic partnership between emperor and commander led a hard-fought campaign of reconquest to restore the ancient grandeur of the Roman Empire, spanning east and west. The story of this daring attempt would unfold across 2 decades and 3 continents. And although the great work would fall short of its mighty ambitions, it would shape indelibly the medieval world that came after, and raise Justinian and Belisarius, in the eyes of history, into figures of legend. The tale begins in 527 AD, when Emperor Justinian I ascended to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire, what later historians in the West would call the Byzantine Empire. And there grew in him an idea that many would have considered madness rather than statecraft. Justinian looked upon the political map of the Mediterranean world and saw the canvas for restoring the full power of an empire. Now the Vandals, who had breached the walls of Rome in 455, ruled from North Africa, governing what was once the empire's major grain supply. Within Italy, Ostrogothic kings sat upon thrones in Rome and Ravenna, while Roman traditions had still held sway under the kings Odoacer and Theodoric. The new generation of rulers had all but abolished the remnants of Roman identity. Spain lay under the control of the Visigoths, while the territory of Gaul was ruled by the Franks. To many, this division of the old Roman world seemed permanent for a new era of history, the inevitable result of centuries of decline and fracture. But the Emperor Justinian, from his throne in Constantinople, saw opportunity. In his mind, there was but one true Roman Empire, sundered for now, but destined for reunification under rightful command. In his eyes, the barbarian kingdoms that ruled the former Western Empire were illegitimate successors to Rome's past, holding stolen territory that belonged by right to the heirs of Caesar and Augustus and Constantine, who had founded the new Byzantine capital after his own name. This, for Justinian, was more than mere political ambition. It was also a sacred mission. Devoutly Christian and dedicated to his role as a spiritual authority, Justinian believed himself to be God's chosen instrument for restoring Orthodox Christian unity. After all, the barbarian kingdoms were not only foreign powers. Many were also Arian Christians, whom Orthodox believers considered heretical to the true faith. By reconquering these territories, Justinian would restore the empire as well as bring right belief to lands corrupted by false doctrines. But that vision would remain fantasy, without a mighty sword to forge that new order. And fate provided him with precisely the man he needed to carry Rome's banner back to the west, an officer named Belisarius, whose brilliance would astonish. Flavius Belisarius had entered Justinian's service as a young man in the 520s, when the soon-to-be emperor was still serving as his uncle Justin's advisor. Little is known of Belisarius's early life, perhaps born around 505 AD on the borders of Thrace, to a family of modest means, like many who had made their career in the armies of Rome. His first opportunity to show his prowess came during Justinian's Iberian War against the Sasanian Persian Empire, the latest conflict in an ancient rivalry that had consumed enormous resources on both sides for centuries. In battles along the eastern frontier, Belisarius learned to coordinate different types of troops with cavalry, infantry, and siege weapons in adaptable combinations. News of his victory at the decisive Battle of Dara in 530 caused a sensation in Constantinople and established Belisarius as the most promising commander of his generation. As time went on, after his actions in the devastating Nika riots in Constantinople in 532 between warring civilian factions, Belisarius's reputation was solidified as a trusted and reliable soldier. By 533, Justinian set in motion his grand design of restoration. The empire's first target would be the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, whose naval power allowed them to dominate the central Mediterranean from the fertile lands of Carthage and its surrounding territories. The expedition Justinian launched against the Vandals was remarkable for its scale. A massive armada carried infantry, cavalry, and the supplies needed for an extended campaign across hostile seas to distant shores, rivaling anything attempted at the height of the Roman Empire. Belisarius commanded the expedition with characteristic attention to detail and careful planning, understanding that success would depend on maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of sea, managing relationships with the local populations, and setting down lasting control over the reconquered lands. Beyond winning battles, the campaign would test every aspect of his skill in administration, logistics, and building coalitions. Fortune favored the Romans upon their first landing. The Vandal king Gelimer was absent from his capital of Carthage when the imperial fleet appeared off the African coast. This stroke of luck allowed Belisarius to establish a safe camp and begin his advance without immediate resistance from full Vandal strength. When Gelimer did return, the two forces met at a site called Ad Decimum, 10 miles outside Carthage, in battle that would end in triumph for Belisarius and flight for Gelimer. The way to Carthage was opened, and the city was captured without a major siege. Belisarius was able to use promises of clemency rather than force to convince the surrender of the city, a tactic he would deploy frequently both to preserve resources and to win hearts and minds. The effect soon rippled throughout other cities in Africa that switched allegiances to the Romans. Within months, Gelimer surrendered his crown, and the Vandal kingdom had collapsed, its territories restored to imperial control after a century. With North Africa secured, Justinian and Belisarius turned their attention to Italy, the heartland of the ancient empire, the domain of the Caesars. The Ostrogothic realm of King Theodoric and the city of Ravenna had in fact been a model of cooperation between Roman tradition and Germanic rule, preserving a great deal of the administrative structure and cultural bedrock of the old empire. But by the 530s, Theodoric and his vision were long dead, and ruthless internal divisions within the Gothic nobility made an opening for the Romans of Byzantium to advance. Cause for war came when the Gothic queen Amalasuntha, the daughter of Theodoric, was murdered in 535 AD. Justinian seized upon this crime to justify military action against the Gothic regime, and claimed that he was doing so to fulfill his obligation to protect Roman citizens, since Amalasuntha had held the rank of a senator and imperial citizenship. While the Vandals had ruled over a population that welcomed the liberating Romans, the Gothic kingdom had deeper roots and more complicated loyalties. Many Italians had prospered under Gothic rule and feared that domination from Constantinople would bring heavy taxation and orthodox persecution of Arian Christian believers. Belisarius began the campaign with boldness, landing in Sicily and quickly securing the island as a base of operations against the mainland. With a relatively small army of some 8,000 men, his forces seemed hardly adequate for conquering a kingdom with tens of thousands of warriors at its disposal. But Belisarius was a master of pushing scant resources to maximum gain. Speed and mobility were the key to his early successes, as he targeted strategic points to break Gothic resistance. Cities that submitted were treated with generous mercy and protection. Those that did not faced the full fury of Roman might. In the south, Naples fell after a siege in which Belisarius's engineers exploited a forgotten aqueduct to breach the city's defenses. When the army moved north, and at last the ancient capital was within reach, Rome opened its gates without resistance when the Gothic garrison fled. Belisarius entered the Eternal City in triumph, the first imperial general to do so in over half a century. But the Goths were far from finished. Under their new king Vitiges, they assumed the largest army they had ever fielded, and themselves descended on Rome, determined to crush the empire's forces before they could gather more strength. The siege of Rome began in March of 537. Vitiges brought nearly 100,000 soldiers to dig in around the city, outnumbering Belisarius's garrison by more than 10 to 1. But where others might have abandoned the city or negotiated terms, Belisarius put his mind and his men to work. He soon mobilized Rome's population to organize valuable support units that could repair fortifications, carry supplies, and even fight when called for. Short of numbers to create a full perimeter of defense, he focused his attention on responsiveness to attacks and control of key positions within the city. Belisarius refused to remain passive behind Rome's walls, launching raids that targeted Gothic supplies and siege equipment, and captured prisoners who could reveal enemy plans. As months passed and the siege dragged on with shifting fortunes, it became a battle of wills as well as arms. Belisarius appealed to Justinian for aid, which the emperor had readily sent, but the relieving force was delayed. On the ground, the general distrusted the loyalties of the populace, who were long accustomed to Gothic rule, and kept vigilance on events within the walls as much as those without. The siege finally ended 1 year later, in March of 538, when Vitiges, faced with rebellions in northern Italy and the approach of Roman reinforcements, abandoned the siege and retreated northward. Belisarius had achieved what seemed impossible, defending the ancient capital of Rome with a small garrison against overwhelming odds. The moral impact of this victory resonated throughout Europe, showing that the new Rome of Constantinople still had generals worthy of the empire's feats of old. And yet, the victory had come at a steep price for Rome. The damage sustained by the city's infrastructure, especially its vital aqueducts, would have ruinous implications in the generations to come and only hastened its long decay from past glory. The successful defense of Rome paved the way for a rapid expansion of imperial control throughout central and southern Italy. When events turned to the north, the cities of Rimini, Urbino, Fiesole, and Osimo were taken, but Belisarius's comrades failed to secure Milan, which suffered destruction by the Goths after long siege. Vitiges himself had fled to his capital of Ravenna, and in 540 AD, as Belisarius trained his eyes on this well-fortified city, events soon took a drastic turn on the other side of the empire, as an invasion by the Persians was mounting to the east. From Constantinople, Justinian sent word to recall his finest commander away from Italy to counter this new threat. Gothic resistance was weakened, but not yet broken, and imperial administration of Italy was still fragile. Some accounts attributed Justinian's removal of Belisarius to jealousy or suspicion, as the threat of a popular, successful commander to the throne had long bedeviled Roman emperors. But the historian Procopius judged at the time that Justinian's core motivation was indeed the Persian menace, and Belisarius was simply the best man to solve the situation. Nevertheless, rumors of Justinian's jealousy or fear of Belisarius would endure for the rest of both their lives. At the fortified gates of Ravenna, what ensued in this last act of the First Gothic War was a game of pretense and deception. Anxious to shift his attention eastward, Justinian issued generous terms to the Goths to hastily end the war, pledging a partition of Italy between Roman control south of the River Po and Gothic governance in the north. To this, the Gothic nobles had agreed. But when news of these orders arrived, Belisarius refused to support the treaty, unwilling to sacrifice what they had fought long and hard to achieve up and down the peninsula. The Goths, for their part, knew that Ravenna would fall in but a matter of time, so they made overtures to the general to bring him into their graces with the promise of making him emperor of the West. This offer roused the attention of Belisarius, but not his ambition, as a man who remained both steadfastly loyal to his emperor and fully committed to capturing the Gothic capital. And so he used this promise as leverage with the Goths to get what he most wanted: victory over Ravenna. Pretending that he was fully accepting their offer of power, but with no intention of really doing so, he marched his army triumphantly through the city's gates without a fight, on the basis of a useful lie. Vitiges was taken prisoner and sent to Constantinople to live out his days, and Ravenna lay once again in Roman hands, claimed by Belisarius's forces in the name of Emperor Justinian. One last bloodless victory before the war in Italy drew down to a temporary close. With Ravenna secured and the Goths leaderless, and under pressure of the impending Persian threat to which he was being recalled, soon Belisarius was carried back east to the Persian frontiers beyond. It was a pivotal moment in the grand plan of reconquest, one that perhaps, in hindsight, sealed its fate. Italy was left under garrison for over a decade, in which time the Gothic forces again grew strong with imperial eyes turned elsewhere. A second war in Italy soon loomed on the horizon. In the east, the Persian campaign would stretch the empire's resources thin for over 20 years, forcing Justinian to commit troops there and diminish focus on the recent gains in the west. Belisarius' service on the Persian front would last from 541 to 544, until the threat was well enough contained that he was reappointed to Italian command. But by that time, he returned to find that Gothic resistance had revived under a capable new king, Totila, whose military prowess and appeals to the support of Italians had undone much of what the Romans had fought to win back. And this, combined with the devastating plague that swept through Justinian's realm in the 540s, meant that the empire's commitments were stretched like never before. This second phase of the Gothic Wars proved far more grueling than the first. Totila was a more challenging opponent than Vitiges, and understood that he could not match imperial forces in pitched battle. Instead, he could exhaust them through raids and sieges, and won over the support of many Italians who had grown disillusioned with imperial rule. Where Belisarius had once been welcomed as a liberator, he now met populations that viewed Constantinople as the true foreign occupier. The campaign that followed was a grinding war of attrition over nearly a decade. Belisarius, effective as ever, won battles and took strongholds, but with each victory the demands seemed higher, and a decisive victory further out of reach. His army was smaller than in the first campaign, and his supply lines more tenuous. Rome itself fell back into Gothic hands before being recaptured by Belisarius. But then, once again and for the last time, Belisarius was recalled from duty in Italy in the year 551 and ordered back to Constantinople. With this reappointment, the general would never again return to Italy. The climax of this Second Gothic War came at the Battle of Taginae in 552 AD, when the Roman general Narses crushed the Goths and their king Totila was killed. It was a successful end to a turbulent war, but after 2 decades, even this result had come at a staggering price. The land of Italy lay devastated. Its remaining infrastructure was terminally weakened, its population decimated, its cities ruined. The grand reconquest and reunification of the Roman Empire had laid waste the very glories Justinian had coveted. By this time, it was becoming clear that the vision of imperial restoration faced limitations that genius and tenacity could not overcome. The empire had indeed reclaimed vast territories in Africa and Italy, and established footholds in Spain, and restored imperial control over the Mediterranean Sea. But the resources of New Rome were stretched by the West, especially under continual threats from the Persians and the nations on the Danube, who sought to capitalize on Byzantium's westward gaze and the effects of an empire-wide pandemic. The aging Belisarius would be pressed into service by Justinian once more in 559 to resist an invasion by the Huns across the Danube, which he accomplished with his usual energy and tactical cunning. In retirement, he stood accused of conspiring against the emperor and was sentenced by the magistrate to house arrest. But Justinian himself pardoned his general of any crime and restored his good name and standing. Belisarius remained respected and favored for the rest of his years. He had achieved more than any Roman commander since the great days of Augustus and Trajan, and proven that the military valor of Rome was far from faded. Yet he had also faced the reality that no measure of success can overcome the fundamental constraints of geography, manpower, and money. These, not glory and grandeur, were the true arbiters of empire. Belisarius and Justinian both died within months of each other in the year 565, and with them perished the dream of imperial restoration as their successors lacked both the resources and the attention to maintain the Western conquests. Within a generation, much of what had been won with such incredible effort had been lost to the empire again, never to be regained. War-torn Italy fell to the Germanic Lombards within a few years of Justinian's death. North Africa held out longer, but would pass under Arab rule in less than 100 years. Of all the western territories that Belisarius had conquered, only scattered enclaves would remain, and even these would be whittled away in time. And yet, while the military and political aims of the great campaigns would come to naught, it left behind important legacies. The restoration of Orthodox Christianity to Africa and Italy, the revival of Roman law in lands that had been governed by Germanic custom, and the cultivation of classical learning and literature in reconquered territories. These accomplishments endured long after the last imperial troops had withdrawn. The city of Ravenna, once the capital of late Roman emperors, and then the Goths, remained a territory of Byzantium in Italy, known as the Exarchate. Under the administration of imperial officials and Orthodox Christian bishops, Ravenna became a cultural outpost of Constantinople in the west, the site of magnificent artworks and architecture in the Eastern style. To this day, lavish mosaics adorn the Basilica of San Vitale that depict the Emperor Justinian, his Queen Theodora, and their respective retinues in full splendor. Among Justinian's entourage stands a man with graying beard and stern features, identified as his finest commander, Belisarius. By the time the Frankish king Charlemagne, in the 770s AD, ascended the throne and visited Ravenna, the Exarchate had long passed. But the example of its wonders inspired him in his own kingship to adopt Roman customs of rule, adorn his capital of Aachen in the grand Byzantine style with artifacts from Ravenna itself, and initiate a vibrant renaissance of classical learning steeped in the traditions of ancient Rome. The new Holy Roman Empire, established in Europe under Charlemagne some 2.5 centuries after the failed restoration of the 500s AD, is perhaps one culmination of what Justinian and Belisarius had attempted to achieve. In the long view of history, perhaps the tragedy of Justinian's restoration was not that it failed, but that it succeeded well enough to show what might have been. Had both emperor and general possessed greater resources, faced weaker foes, or inherited from the last century a better starting point, the dream of restoring the Roman Empire may well have come true. Although their ultimate aim escaped them, Justinian and Belisarius, the emperor and the commander, left to the world feats worthy of the epics of old. That even in the twilight of antiquity, the vision and valor of Rome had not yet passed from the world.